Well, it being after 6:30, 6:35, I'm going to call this meeting to order. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the governor issued Executive Order 2020-04 and Emergency Order number 12 that waived the location requirement of public officials at a public meeting. So this meeting is going to be conducted electronically on Zoom, and following that order, I'm going to call for a roll call. Charlie Bozello
is here.
Mardine Badger.
Here.
Dave Toth here. Alan Silly not present. Following the agenda, I was going to review the minutes, but I don't think I looked at the minutes that Susan was able to provide, and I think that we have approved all of those minutes already. So I'm going to move right along, and one thing or actually two things have happened since since our last meeting. Eli Badger has resigned, and I'm going to read his resignation letter. He said, "To all concerned, I'm resigning my position as alternate member of the ZBA. Two of the reasons are, one, I feel that having two members of the BOS, the Board of Select, on the ZBA is unwise, and two, I feel there may be a perceived conflict with Mardine and I sitting on the same board." So so Eli has resigned. Alan Silly, I believe, is still on the board.
He's listed as an alternate member.
He's an alternate member.
Yeah.
Okay. Also since then, Susan McLeod, who is down in the lower right-hand corner of my screen, has been appointed as the land use assistant, is it?
Yeah.
Mhm. And I feel very, very fortunate to have Susan in that position, since she has a tremendous amount of experience. She chaired the planning board for many years, and really has been instrumental in dealing with a lot of the planning issues for the town ever since I've been a resident of the town. So her expertise is really, really extremely valuable as far as I'm concerned. The reason that I called this meeting really at Susan's behest, but I had wanted to do this anyway, and that is I wanted to review some of the basic procedures and decision-making criteria that we are required to use as a ZBA. I know since Charlie and I have been on the ZBA, there's only been one case, Charlie?
None that I participated in.
Charlie didn't. There's only been one case that I participated in. Charlie has not participated in any cases. Charlie, you've been on the ZBA in other places?
I have. I served for several years in a town significantly larger than Ashland. So I have some, hands-on experience and some background.
Mm-hmm. Was that in New Hampshire or was that elsewhere?
It was not in New Hampshire. It was in New York, actually.
In New York. So I'm not sure whether the the rules of procedure and the decision-making process are the same or similar. I did
review them. They're very much in line with each other. So, because I got somebody forwarded this information to me earlier on, and I was able to review it. And so I felt comfortable that the process follows closely that which I'm familiar with.
Okay, and I know that Alan was chair for a while, and Alan presided over a single case. But Alan has about the same amount of experience that I do on ZBAs, and so I was hoping that he would be here so that when we reviewed this, or when we went over this, he would be here to hear this as well. But anyway, I put together some very basic information that kind of pulls out the most basic key items that I saw, and as I looked through the materials, and just so we could talk about it and review it, and at least we would be on the same page for that. Should a case arise, and we'd have an idea of what process we would be going through and how we would be expected to come to a decision about that particular case. I think to begin with, there are a couple of things that I think are important, and one is that as members of the ZBA, we're really not allowed to speak to anyone who is applying for a variance or a special exception. If anybody does approach us, we are to say that we really can't speak to them and refer them to Susan, who can fill them in on what they are to do and in order to make the application, and explain to them how the whole process works, and the relationship between the planning board and the ZBA, so that they're familiar with that. We really have to remain totally objective, and shouldn't be talking to any of the applicants. So I think that's an important thing. And I think, as chair, I think that's one of the questions I would ask before starting a hearing would be, did any of the applicants speak to any members of the ZBA prior to the hearing, just so we know that they haven't, and if they have, then whoever has done that really needs to recuse themselves from the hearing. As members of the ZBA, I'm going to see if I can. I'm new to Zoom, as you can probably tell, and I'm going to see if I can bring up the document so that we can take a look at it.
Yeah, there's a share screen.
Yes, I'm hitting share screen, and
There it is.
There it is.
you can see it?
Yes.
Could you
Okay,
maybe
good, 'cause
Could you enlarge it just a little bit, maybe?
I can't even see it, so I'm not sure how to enlarge it. Let me
Go
see.
down to in your Word document, go down to the bottom where you've got 100%.
Yeah,
Pull that up.
okay, how
Increase
about,
it.
is that
Try
better?
try 150. Pull it up to about 150. See
Right.
if that helps.
Okay, there's 150. How's that?
That's better. You can go up a little further. Yeah.
Okay. 200?
Yeah, let's try it. Okay. Maybe that's a little too much. Well,
Yeah, no, the screen just readjusted, but I'm losing some of the left margin.
pull it down to about 180. Move your, on that little bar at the, on the bar at the bottom, go to your minus sign and click on it once.
Is that any better?
There.
Yep, perfect.
That's good.
Okay. Well, too bad we've run out of time.
No.
Um, in terms of our jurisdiction on the ZBA, we have jurisdiction over a number of things. I can name them all if anybody's interested, but I think the ones that we are most often called to take action on are variances and special exceptions. So variance, someone would apply for permission to do something that's not permitted by an ordinance. And a special exception is an exception that is permitted under an ordinance under certain circumstances. So there is a slight difference there, and the decision-making process is slightly different when it comes to those two things. The only case I've been involved in was a variance where the Historical Society was asking to build a longer platform out in front of the train station, and the platform didn't meet the zoning requirements. Now, in terms of the public hearing, you can see there's a whole list of things that take place, a whole list of things in a sequence that take place during the hearing, and a sequence of events that should be followed during the public hearing. The public hearing is held, as I understand it, during a regular meeting. So you have a regular meeting of which the public hearing is part. The chairman, of course, is in control of this, and during the meeting, members of the board may ask questions at any point. And there are requirements of, of what information applicants have to tell us about themselves and so forth. But basically the process is to hear from the applicant and those people supporting the applicant's position. Then to hear from the opposition, if there is one, and those people supporting the opposition. The applicant then has an opportunity for a rebuttal, and the opposition then too has an opportunity for a rebuttal. At the end, the chair presents a summary of what's taken place, and the hearing is then closed. And then the board, I believe, can decide to rule on the application at that point, or schedule another meeting to rule on the application. Susan, I'm not sure how much time we are allowed. Is it 2 weeks?
Well, I know the planning board has 65 days from the actual vote to accept the application and then start the discussion on it. And all boards should be advised that they do not have to make the decision the first time they hear something, especially if any additional information that comes up that needs to be explored and further information gathered, then you make sure that you do continue the hearing. Because too many times it is a rushed deal, and especially with ZBA decisions, well, because ZBA is also the last step in the process, in a local process where somebody's either appealing a planning board decision or a building inspector's decision or even a selectman's decision or whatever, the next step would be court. So you have to make sure that you really spend the time to make the best decision.
Also, also, as part of the public hearing, we are also allowed to call upon experts, our own experts, in addition to the experts that the applicant may have or those in opposition may have as well, depending on how complicated the case is, I think. And in each case, you know, I've only been involved in a few of the variances, and one of them was extremely complicated, and on the other hand, most of the other ones are fairly straightforward, or that I've seen have been fairly straightforward. As a board, the next part has to do with the decision-making criteria. And this is really important because our decision is not based on our personal opinions, but is based on our interpretation and our analysis and interpretation of these specific criteria.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, it's also specifically on the use of the land.
Right.
You might not like what is going to be built there or something, but that is not part of what the decision making is about either. It's about the actual use of the land and meeting the criteria as to whether or not you grant the variance for somebody to usually build something is what most often is the case.
And another thing that's important to note is these criteria come directly from RSAs. They are not created locally. These are specified in one of the RSAs dealing with zoning boards of adjustment.
And as members of the zoning board, we are required to explain our reasoning. So each of us is required to explain our reasoning, and that reasoning has to be recorded because this could go to court. And as Susan has told me that court cases very often depend on how well our reasoning has been recorded and how well the reasoning conforms to the criteria. So those two things are important. And the other thing I would say is that we're really responsible for trying to do the best thing for both the applicant and the abutters and the community. So I think this is an important charge. So the first criteria is the variance may not be now, when we're talking about variances, we're talking about conforming to existing zoning ordinances, which can be found on the town website, and we should become as familiar as we can with those. And I would imagine that once we do get, once we do get a case, that, we will be going back and looking at those ordinances very carefully before we proceed with the hearing. But so our first decision is to see whether the variance is contrary to the public interest. And so
that's usually lumped with the second one because they're very closely tied, not contrary to public interest and not contrary to the spirit of the ordinance.
Right.
And even if you look at court cases, they tend to put the two of those together because they really are very tightly interconnected.
Yeah.
Mainly because the zoning ordinance is voted in by the residents of the town.
Right.
So, the public interest is supposed to be also reflected in what they said yes to in the way of ordinances that deal with the development of this town. So
Yeah, and it looks like the two is,
them together.
yeah, it looks like the essential criteria are, does the, you know, would granting the variance alter the essential character of the locality? Or would it threaten public health, safety, or welfare? When I only sat in on the on the case that the veterans brought. What was the name of that organization?
Soldier On.
Soldier On.
Several
Soldier On
years ago.
wanted to build a home in Ashland, right on property that was near or above Dairy Joy. And a lot of the arguments from the you know, from the audience anyway had to do with both A and B. They felt these people were a threat to public safety and that the buildings would alter the essential character of that particular area of town. The third criteria is substantial justice is done. And I guess the key thing here, and Susan or Mardine, you can correct me, but it says the guiding rule is that any loss to the individual that is not outweighed by a gain to the general public is an injustice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That states it pretty clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of weighing public interest, especially of the abutters, I would imagine, against the private interest of the individual who wants the variance.
Yeah. And one key little phrase in that explanation, number 3, it says each case must be individually determined by board members. In other words, each case is an individual case.
Right. And also it says the injustice must be relieved by granting the variance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Forest has to do with property values, and in this case, but you know, the applicant would probably present evidence from a realtor about how this might affect property values, and if there was any opposition, they would probably do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Susan, you said in Soldier On that both sides used the same information. So
Yeah, that was interesting. There was an article that they both presented as evidence about the property values. Obviously, the applicant said that it would improve the property values, and the abutter who opposed said that if you read the last part of this, it says the opposite. So as a board member, you had to read it, take both sides of the arguments and try to do something with that. And even then you could ask for another expert for some kind of input on it.
Yeah.
right, and I think that's where you would probably have to go, and of course, determining property values can be fairly subjective.
It's difficult to find comparables as what realtors do. Is if you were looking at the project for this 50-unit development, you'd have to try to find one similar in a similar neighborhood to see what the impact had been, whether it was neutral, whether it was positive or negative.
Right.
They can be hard to find.
And the final criteria is literal enforcement of the provisions of the ordinance would result in an unnecessary hardship. and this has to do, I think, with actually, I'm not really sure how to interpret this one. So maybe Susan or Mardine, you
This
can
is,
talk a little bit about this one.
this is the tougher one.
This one bounced around in court a lot because some of the earlier cases, what they really focused on was the word unnecessary. That if there was any reason to put somebody through something that was really not required to use their property, then it became an unnecessary hardship. So then you'd say, we can't enforce this, and so you'd have to vote that it was an unnecessary hardship, and therefore you can grant the variance. Then it changed over to trying to figure out what a hardship actually is, because they went back and forth as to whether or not to consider financial hardship as one of the criteria that should be taken into consideration. And I think in the end, when they once again changed the law in 2009, they tried to clarify this point, which is why they broke it into the A and B components, that it could either be that for A, you're determining the purpose of the restriction that's in question. So you go back to say, is like, well, why was this sort of setback? You know, how did they reach this setback? And if this property has special conditions where this setback can't be reached, what was the purpose of the setback? And if it was to try to keep things further apart or want more open space or something, you have to look at what the conditions of the property were up against in the way of the actual zoning regulations. So then they started focusing on the special conditions of what makes a property unique, that, you know, person one can't do the same thing with his property like all his surrounding neighbors can, because his property in particular in this neighborhood has something about it, whether it's slope or odd setbacks or ledge or something else, that they have to make some variation in how they could build on it. And that's when they come for, we have to change where the setback is or something like that. So that's also tied into the special conditions of a property. And because that property is different, but they want to do something similar to what is also in the neighborhood or in the vicinity, that would be their unnecessary hardship, is what the land is not allowing them specifically to do.
Yeah, I could think of there's that piece of property on River Street that's for sale on the right-hand side as you're going towards the marina. I think it's under contract right now.
Well, it was, and then it wasn't, because they did ask the planning board about it.
Yeah. And now I think it is again, and
Okay.
it's both slope and ledge.
We'll have to watch for that one.
Yeah, and that's a good example of a piece of property that has special conditions, and it's similar to other pieces of property in that neighborhood, but none of them have quite the slope or the ledge that this particular one has. So anyway, that I think might be an example of that if that ever came forward. So those are the things that we have to, those are the 5 things that we have to discuss and determine when we grant a variance or not. Now, I'm not sure, do they have to meet all the criteria?
Yes.
So if they don't, if they don't meet one of the criteria, we don't grant the variance.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
That usually will get an appeal. But again, you don't have to rehear unless there is something new provided. They can't come back with the same exact plan and want to do a redo completely.
Okay.
There has to be some kind of change in the information, or again, a good example, a few years ago, the ZBA heard this, they wanted to place a house in one of those non-conforming smaller lots along the river. And where they wanted to place it was where they wanted it, closer to the road, because they didn't want to upset the backyard. And it was rejected that time because they could meet the front setback, but they didn't want to. So they rethought it, redid a whole new site plan, resited the house in a different location with a different
orientation.
confirmation of the house itself. And then they got the variance because they found they could find a way to be way more in conformance with what they were working with.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the criteria for special exceptions is really simpler.
Well, the criteria for special exceptions you will find on our zoning board application form.
Okay.
They are in our zoning ordinance in section 6.3.1, but the criteria are also listed specifically on the application form, because those are more created by the local ordinance.
Okay.
And
so,
I can
the
read
ordinance, it might say that something has to be a certain way, except under this limited condition.
I can read you from the application. I can read you what the criteria are for a special exception. Just the first one, the specific site. These are the criteria that have to be met for a special exception. The specific site is an appropriate location for the intended use or structure. Second, the use will be compatible with neighboring land uses. Third, the property values in the zone and in the surrounding area will not be reduced by such a use. 4, there will be no nuisance or serious hazard to vehicles or pedestrians. Next, adequate and appropriate facilities will be provided for the proper operation of the proposed use. Next, the proposed use will comply with the minimum lot sizes, frontages, and setback requirements. And last, existing road and highways are capable of carrying the additional traffic. So as I said, those are in our zoning ordinance and are on the application.
Can you think of a case that we've had for a special exception?
Most of our cases tend to be more variances. Trying to think, special exception. Was there any special exception within the Soldier On case, Susan?
No, there were
I don't think
variances.
it was all variance.
And a waiver in the building regulations.
Yeah, that's right.
Then there was the argument with the Lester case because for some reason the documentation from '93 could not be located in any file anywhere as to whether he had been granted a special exception or a variance. It should have been a variance because he ended up getting granted a use that was strictly prohibited in but that possibly could have been a special exception based on how the use came to be.
To have a veterinary hospital in a residential, But most of our cases tend to be variances, and they may sometimes they're as simple as the front setback is X number of feet and they want to build the building a little closer to the road. Or
Right.
the rear setback is X number of feet, say from the river or from the lake, and they want to be a little bit closer than what the setbacks allow. So those are more typical
Right.
variances.
And well, the other thing to remember is both variances and special exceptions ride with the property. So when you grant,
Yes.
they are there with that lot and map number forever, except for the variances that are granted to people with disabilities that may need to build a ramp that doesn't meet
Extends and-
setback, or some of
Yeah.
those criteria that you can kind of waive for the particular use, but that does expire when that person
Is no longer.
no longer at that property.
Yeah. So that's another reason to be very careful about evaluating the criteria for every single issue and justifying it very carefully, whether you decide to grant that criteria or not. Is very, very important to justify it each individually.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
no,
only
I agree. I don't know if Charlie is aware of the Lester case, but the specific of the case are not as important as what that decision cost the town in legal fees. In the years of how long did that case go on? I mean, it was years.
Yeah,
So-
well, there were several other things that happened prior to it finally coming to the planning board.
The final case, yeah.
Yeah.
The final case. And here's the other thing that the ZBA might hear, and that is appeals by planning board decisions. Now, again, it can't be every planning board decision. It has to be specifically on a board decision based on the zoning ordinance that they think has been applied incorrectly. Because that went back and forth, and it wasn't so much even the applicant suing the town, it was abutters who were happy with any decision along the way from either the zoning board or the planning board.
Yeah.
Along those lines, I know from my experience, one of the difficult things a board has to deal with is when the decision is not unanimous. How do you present the majority view, and what do you do about the dissenting view? You know, how a board handles that is somewhat sensitive, and I think a board, you have to decide how you're gonna do that when it's not a unanimous decision.
Yeah, there is with when the zoning board gets to the point of voting on each of the criteria, there have been over the years a couple ways of tabulating, making the votes and tabulating the votes. What's I think most important is that the board set a method of voting. For instance, if when you vote on one criteria, if it passes by a majority of the votes, then that criteria passes. Then all of the other criteria need to pass by a majority of the vote. There was another, and I don't remember quite the twist on the other method of voting, but it's very important that you decide consistently from one case to the next how you were going to handle the actual voting. And we probably ought to at some point review those slight variations to decide exactly how we're going to vote on each criteria and how the tabulation will be done.
Yeah, because the legislature tried to insert on that and make it even more difficult. The other thing with these boards is they're supposed to have 5 full voting members. And if you do not have 5, you give the applicant the choice of whether or not they want to continue with the case. Because when we've had only 3 voting members, then it has to be unanimous. You can't have a 2-to-1 vote on anything. All 3 would have to be in agreement on each and every one of the criteria.
That's right. And I misspoke just a moment ago. It has to be a majority of 5 members. It's not a majority of the number that are there. It has to be a majority of 5.
So right now, we don't have 5 members.
No. So we would have to, if we were hearing a case right now and voting on a criteria, all 3 of us would have to agree on a criteria for it to be approved, for it to pass.
Which of course places a considerable burden on the applicant, because it's a lot easier to convince 3 out of 5 than it is 3 out of 3.
Right,
Which is
yes.
something that I think should concern us as a board. I mean, I don't know, you know, being kind of new, I don't know how many cases we'll get, even if we'll get a case this year. But, you know, and I think there should be some effort on the town to staff this board fully.
Absolutely.
It's really only the fair thing to do.
Yes, because
Agreed.
if the applicant comes to the board with their application and we say we only have 3 members here, you have the option of delaying this hearing until we have a full board of 5. The town would have to scramble to fill that board in time for us to reschedule that hearing.
The problem that has come up a lot in my past is timing. You know, as Susan pointed out, you have to do your homework on this and your due diligence as a board, and you want to make the correct decision. However, the applicant is always in the position where perhaps they have some financial interest, and it's affected by how long it takes to make that decision. So, I mean, in what you were just saying, it concerns me because, you know, how long would it take to fill the board if an applicant wouldn't accept, you know, the 3 member board, and what burden that could place on the applicant, which in my mind is unfair, because, I mean, it's bad enough we make them come and present their case and they have legal fees and administrative fees involved. We don't want to be in a position of unduly delaying an outcome, particularly if it could be favorable to the applicant.
Yeah. And the board is also bound by specific timelines set by RSAs during that governs the process from the application being submitted and how long the board has to make that decision.
Yeah, well, it's usually that when they accept an application, you have to act within, let's see, it has to be notified 5 days prior to the hearing. And then after the hearing is closed, you have 30 days to deliberate to come to a decision.
Right.
So you basically get maybe 2 meetings at most, unless the applicant asks to extend the deadline.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
How are decisions rendered? Is it a written decision of the board in the end?
Yes.
Yes. Within 5 days, they need a written decision with the reasoning, like, especially if you deny, you have to state in your notice of decision all the reasons it was denied, because that also gives them the opportunity to, if they want to appeal, to think of what they have to rework in order to appeal the case.
Yeah.
And how is that prepared? Who will prepare that? Susan, is that you do?
Well, the chairman, well, you know, again, the land use assistant in the past has also helped either draft something or at least get it out in the mail or whatever else, but it's usually the chairman who writes the notice of decision.
Yeah. But it is all based on the deliberation of the board, and all of that should be in the minutes. So
Right.
as the board deliberates on the individual criteria prior to voting on each criteria, they should have they should state publicly, and it should be in the minutes, why that criteria is either met or not met, and then the vote should support that. So all that background information for the notice of decision should be in the minutes, and then that is represented in the notice of decision.
What about deliberations among the board members that are not intended for publication? They may be clarifications between board members. They may be subjects, like I know have come up in the past with me, as just exactly what is an injustice. That is something that I'm amazed at how many different views of injustices there are.
It's a public meeting, and all that discussion is in public.
I mean, you can't take it off the record. I mean,
no, you would, there is no off the record. There is non-public session, which is controlled by 91A, which is the right to know law. And there are only very specific reasons for which you can go into a non-public session. I would say it's probably very rare that either a planning board or zoning board would find that necessary to do. I've never come across that yet. So it's open discussion to the public.
Okay, that's a little different than my past, but fine. That can make it pretty dicey, especially from a legal point.
Yes, it can.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the other thing that makes things a little bit easier here for the applications now is having pushed to have the ZBA at least post a regular monthly meeting. Because from that meeting, you can backtrack to setting a deadline for an application to be received, to be heard at the next meeting. So if you need the 5 days, not including the day it's published or the day of the meeting, in order to have something in the newspaper and have all of that out, then you can have your deadline, say the the first Wednesday of the month, in order to be heard on the third Thursday of the month or whatever. And that will also give the opportunity that now as land use assistant, I could look that application over and see if there's anything missing. Because the other thing that's happened in the past, without anybody being able to really review it closely and make any decisions on contacting the applicant, that their application gets rejected at the public hearing, and then they have to start over again. So in order to avoid not being able to accept the application, because first you accept it to be able to talk about it, and then you approve the application, or you go through the process of whether or not you're going to approve or grant or not grant, depending. But first you have to accept it as complete, that all the information that is required has been is part of the package that is submitted.
Right.
So when it is submitted, there is also that the office will send out the whole packet of, you can review it as individuals. If you have questions about it, now you can come back and ask me, the land assistant, to pursue getting any further information that you might need, so that when it comes to the public hearing, it's not everybody seeing it for the first time and not being able to pursue some of your questions about the application or the project or anything else. So we're trying to get it so that you are better informed when that public hearing comes up.
But we don't do, as a board, we do not do any informal discussion of an application before it is formally presented to us. Susan's role, as she said, will be to go through the application, make sure all the information that is required is on the application. If there's anything missing, she then has the time to contact the applicant. We need this item was not included, or that type of thing. So she does the background work to make sure it's ready for us to discuss when it comes to the formal hearing. And that's one thing that is different between the planning board and zoning board. The planning board has the option of having an informal discussion with actually before an application comes in. We can speak with a potential applicant about what they might be able to do with their property, what parts of the ordinance they should pay attention to. We can have an informal discussion with that person before they come to the planning board with a planning board application. The zoning board is not allowed to do that. We only act on a formal application that is in front of us, and we only discuss it as a formal application in front of us.
Okay, I got it.
It gets a little tricky sometimes, but
Well, I was only, the problem that we had in the past was this whole legal consideration that you bring up. I mean, look, if everybody's in sync and you're just going through the routine of all agreeing, as a committee, that's fine. But if somebody decides that, for whatever reason, that they want to take a different tact and they begin presenting arguments that are contrary to the arguments of the majority, and now you're fanning the flames of the legal process because you're providing information that can be used to further question the decision.
yeah.
And that's why we had informal discussions as a group to air all those types of disagreements, if you will. And when the final decision was reached by the majority, that's what went out as the decision on the case, which limited substantially some of the legal options that the applicant would have.
Interesting.
Just as a point of view.
Yeah. No, there have been cases, and the Soldier On case was one case in it, that it was a very long process. It was not necessarily a friendly process at times. There were a lot of discussions between the applicant and the abutters and the board on went into all that decision. And it gendered a lot of public comments and so on, but it was again, as long as we remember that whatever decision we make has to be supported by the language in the criteria and the relevant ordinances of the town.
Yeah,
Very
that's
important.
especially, well, I have more experience on the planning board, but I certainly did my time on the ZBA too. And you have, like with a planning board, some people think that it's automatically contentious, that somebody is coming before you and you're going to have to fight. And you are representing the best interests of the town as you see it, with all the feedback you've gotten from all the regulations that have been approved, and certainly just your experience of being in town. And of course, your applicant is out for the best interest of what they want to achieve for themselves. And so it's your job to find the balance and find the answers in what we have to work from, which is basically the regulations. And I think with the Soldier On, especially the first hearing, again, it got even crazier because there was one abutter that was not notified, so that they had to have a rehearing starting over again. And there was some change in the board because somebody had resigned. But it really got out of hand because it got off topic. Instead of really talking about the use of the property, it strayed into being allowed for people to get up on soapboxes and talk about supporting homeless veterans or veterans who have are head cases and are going to shoot us all. I mean, all of that came out totally inappropriately.
Yeah.
This is where you have to really make sure that you manage the meeting and call people out of order. Once again, remind people that we're conducting a business meeting and that the people who are allowed to speak in that are the applicant. And then when recognized, the people who have direct impact in the way of abutters can prove they have a specific interest in the case. The public does not ever have to be recognized for having a voice. They're allowed to witness, but they're not necessarily there to participate. And if you keep that in mind and keep that firm hand on the gavel, you get more accomplished. And again, amongst the members themselves, we have to always show respect for each other and allow people to voice their opinion, remind them when they're going off on the wrong, if you start opinionating about the merits of a housing for veterans, you have to be reminded that is not what we are deciding on here. We are deciding on whether these buildings are appropriate for the piece of property they have chosen to use, and yet it's not totally appropriate because they're asking for 5 variances. So that you always have to remind everybody on board to stay on task. It's a lot easier on you too. It's better that when you go out in public, they can make assumptions about what your personal opinion is, but if your personal opinion was never expressed, and that was the other thing with all these tough cases, especially the one that was heading for court, is the first thing the attorney tells you is never go out there and defend yourself. Your vote and what's on your minutes and how you have conducted yourself in the meeting is your one and only defense.
Yeah.
Don't get on Facebook and start answering back to whatever they're saying about you.
No.
Probably good advice not to be on Facebook.
Yeah.
I have recently seen a few comments about some planning board decisions on Facebook, and I purposely do not respond to anything of that type.
Mm-hmm.
If someone has a question about it, they can come to the planning board meeting and ask us there. Yeah.
Well, they can read our minutes and see what the decision is on, but there's no point in responding to all the misinformation and crazy talk that gets thrown around on Facebook.
Does anybody have anything else they'd like to discuss? I thank everybody for all of the input. I certainly have learned a lot, and I hope this was helpful for everybody.
I would just have just an item, David, that I really appreciate, by the way, that you notified me today that there would be a meeting tonight, because I really have been particularly busy, and had you not done that, I wouldn't have thought to be here. So I hope in the future that we have some formal process that says, hey guys, we got a meeting coming up.
Yeah.
Well, we have our meeting is scheduled for the second Thursday
of the month.
every month.
I do put it on the website calendar automatically. And what I have done with planning board meetings is our planning board meets on a Wednesday. I like to have the agenda and any additional materials out at minimum by that Monday before the meeting, but have communicated generally with people before that. Couple little housekeeping things or informational things. On the website, there is a page for the zoning board. And on that page, there is a link to the zoning ordinance. There is a link to the zoning board application. There is also the calendar of meeting dates. Forgetting something else. The meeting schedule, the zoning ordinance, the application, and the minutes of previous meetings. And there is the zoning board email address there. Also on the website, if you go over to the forms and documents page under land use, you will also find zoning ordinance and a lot of other land use related ordinances, which every so often, depending on what case you have, you may need to refer to. And again, the application for the zoning board is there. There are the zoning board email is, as I said, on that page. And we haven't used the zoning board email much, but I would recommend it that we do use that email. And I'm speaking from experience with the planning board. We have found that when we don't do, for instance, when we don't send minutes out or applications out through the planning board email, things get lost. We lose track of our, in a sense, our history of what we've dealt with. So we have tried very hard that when somebody needs to send a document to the board, or if we need to send information out to an applicant or to the board as a whole, that we do it through that planning board email, because there is our history. So what I can do, there is a password to get into it. I will not mention it here. I will send that out to everybody, or Susan will send that out to everybody. To access it, if you go to the website, on the very bottom right-hand corner, there's a little symbol of an envelope. That's where you would go in. So we will send out the login and the password for that email. But that, just through experience with the planning board, I would recommend doing communication that way. Yes, when we send an agenda out, we send it out from the planning board email. And yes, it goes to your individual email addresses. But then if you need to respond to it, respond back to the board email. So something similar should be done with the zoning board. There are a couple other things. If people want printed copies of any of the documents, such as the zoning ordinance, let Susan know. We can run things off at the office. Some people prefer paper. Some people just read it online. Just let Susan know. There is also a handbook, a zoning board handbook, that the state planning
Yeah, I sent that.
division. Okay, you did. Good. That is a good document to review also.
Right. The other two other little points here. If you don't want to have more meetings to just go over procedure and process and everything, the next meeting would be then case driven, in which case you would know in advance, because I would be sending you all the information on the case to remind you that that public hearing would be coming up. The second thing about the emails, having gone through a right to know where they wanted to go into my personal email address, again, the ZBA isn't as active. With the planning board, if you set up a separate Gmail account or something of, Charlie ZBA, so that if you're ever hit with a right to know and they want to go into your phone and your personal email, you can say, my personal email is my personal. I'll get all my town business at this address and you can have it all to see. It got pretty sticky about having to go through what turned out to be thousands of my emails to send to the lawyer, the ones that were pertinent to any kind of town business. And what I felt wasn't town business.
That's real good advice, Susan.
Yeah. And that's what I've done. I've set up a separate Gmail account that I use for my back and forth between the planning board email and at my own end. So it's really helped. It helped me be organized also. The only other thing, Susan, with this book, I don't know if I can hold it up.
They're in the office as well for
Yes, there it is.
there it is.
Yes, you've got it. Comes out every year. The print gets smaller, the paper gets thinner. Okay. That's all I have.
Okay, well, I'm not sure we need to have another meeting on procedure and decision-making criteria. I think we've covered that as well as we possibly can. I think the next meeting will be case-driven.
Yep. And I also want to say, without having a building inspector at the moment, that would usually be the first stop somebody would make. They'd be getting a building permit to put up a house in a, you know, a substandard lot. And the building inspector would say, oh, you can't meet setbacks, you have to go to the ZBA. Without a building inspector at the gate at the moment, you might not, people don't necessarily come forward on their own. They either don't know or they think, well, I don't have to unless I get, you know, I rather ask for forgiveness than ask for permission.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So you might not get any cases. And
Yeah. And yet there may be, we've had a couple informal discussions with a couple relating to a couple properties in town that could, depending on what the property owner decides to do, could come to the planning board. Both of those, I think, would probably involve variances with setbacks, not major issues necessarily. But it will all depend on, we've had just informal discussions with him. It will all depend on what that individual property owner decides to do. So we don't know whether you'll get something from there or not.
okay. And if anybody still has questions or wants any more additional information, I'm in the office every Thursday morning and then every other Monday morning before a planning board meeting to pull together, you know, agenda materials and everything. So, and I'm trying to check the email. However, from a phone, it's almost impossible, but I'll try to keep up with it.
Okay, well, if there's no further discussion, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So
I'll
moved.
second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.